For more on the federal government's announcement on temporary foreign workers, we are now joined by Syed Hussan. He's the executive director of the advocacy group Migrant Workers Alliance for Change. Thanks for being here tonight with us.
Thank you for having me.
You say that with this new policy, the government is scapegoating temporary foreign workers. Can you break that down for us?
Look, for many of us, the wages are too low. We're having trouble when we go buy our groceries. The housing prices are too high. And so people are being convinced the issue is that there are too many immigrants who are taking these jobs, who are raising the wages. But it's just not true. For example, in 2020, Canada closed its border and almost no new migrants were coming, but the housing prices went up historically. And these cuts that the government is talking about, at most, we think it'll be lower, but at most it'll be about 60,000 people. Well, this country has a population of 42 million people. These 60,000 people aren't the ones causing your housing crisis. In fact, they're living in employer-controlled housing, so they're not actually competing for the one family home. So there's a huge distraction taking place, which makes it much harder to deal with the real issues.
When we look back on how we got here, after COVID, of course, we had a labor shortage, and the government relaxed the rules around temporary foreign workers, loosening some of the restrictions. Now the government says that this surge in temporary foreign workers is fueling unemployment specifically for immigrants and also for young people. We're seeing the highest unemployment rates for young people that we've seen in a decade. Wouldn't bringing down the number of migrant workers make things better for everyone, for temporary foreign workers, for immigrants, and for young people in this country?
Look, we've got over an 11% unemployment rate for immigrants, but the unemployment rate for immigrants is always higher because immigrants are the last hired, the first fired. It's because of racism, it's about discrimination. It's also because when new immigrants are coming in, they're not being accredited, they're not being supported to transition into better jobs, their skills are not being developed. So this is a failure of provincial policy. And as I said, the cuts we're talking about aren't that many. 11% unemployment will not be reduced by just removing 60,000 workers. And also the workers are only being reduced in certain sectors. Now, in terms of migrant worker rights themselves, migrant workers are facing exploitation and abuse because they don't have permanent resident status. This announcement does nothing. It's not a question of numbers, it's a question of whoever is here, what are the rights they have, and they have very few.
And you raised some concerns there, and I want to ask you about that because part of your job is advocating for better living and working conditions for temporary foreign workers. We've also heard the government put forward some concerns on that front. We've heard the immigration minister, the employment minister calling out abusive employers and saying that they are taking advantage of temporary foreign workers. Would this not make foreign workers more coveted and treated better and better paid perhaps if the market is less saturated, if there were fewer of them to take care of?
Well, the largest groups of migrant workers come in agriculture, fisheries, domestic work, construction, care work. These are the 5 top industries. All of them are excluded from the announcement today. So in fact, there's not going to be changes on those industries. And those are the people who are living in employer-controlled housing, facing abuse, what the United Nations called breeding ground for contemporary forms of slavery. That exploitation continues because these workers, when they speak up, they can be evicted. The employer can force them out of the country. And when you are under so much duress, when the employer has so much control over your life, then they're going to exploit you. Reducing the numbers doesn't change the conditions for the people already here in the program. They deserve permanent resident status. All of us deserve a real conversation on housing and wages. And linking it to migration actually does a disservice to Canadians and migrants.
Okay. Now, the government says that part of this plan will also include looking at immigration levels overall. So we're talking permanent residents as well as temporary residents. What advice would you give from your experience and from what you've heard from temporary foreign workers, from permanent residents, from people who are in the living conditions that you mentioned there, about what needs to be done in this country in order to really achieve a balance here that works for everybody?
I think what people need to understand is that there are approximately 2 million temporary residents who are entering in the country each year, because that's how many unfilled jobs there are. And also, over 50% of Canada's GDP growth, some say 75% 25% is directly linked to migration and immigration. Cutting immigration will contract the economy, will increase unemployment, will worsen the housing and affordability crisis, not improve it. When we are talking about this very complex issue, blaming migrants, linking it to immigration, actually is only going to fuel racism and xenophobia. We have a problem. There are not enough homes. We have a problem where provinces have failed to put caps on rent increases. They've failed to increase minimum wage. This is a provincial issue. They're the ones responsible for job matching and skills development. Instead, the federal government is using the only lever it has, and it's not going to work. What we need for migrants is permanent resident status, because that is the mechanism through which all other rights are accessed.
Hussan, it's great to get your reaction to this story as it continues to develop, and it will as we move into October. We really appreciate you being on the program today.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's Syed Hussan, Executive Director of Migrant Workers Alliance for Change.